Welcome to our second micro lecture related to American protests, so the history and philosophy of American protests and dissent, radicalism. I've received some constructive feedback already, and before we get into this second part, I want to address some issues that maybe I either missed or I needed to emphasize, or the emphasis was on the wrong place in the first micro lecture. I want to emphasize that in the tradition of American civil disobedience, there is the importance of nonviolence. We will talk about this in a later micro lecture, but I do want to emphasize, I don't think I emphasized it in the first part, but personally, I am convinced of the power of nonviolence, and I would encourage non-violence in direct action movements, in protests, etc. You're always going to have those that take advantage of a situation, those who are going to be violent for a variety of reasons that distract from the good goal of, in this case, racial awareness and racial and social and economic justice in America. Like I said, there's always going to be those who take advantage. All of the great movements that we can look at, and we'll look at in greater extent as we go along, but many of the movements in American history to expand the Declaration of Independence and what that means, there have always been people who have abused or taken advantage of a movement, either internally by way of disagreements that they may have with leadership, or from outside, those that oppose these movements. Martin Luther King, for instance, faced criticism from his own circle of friends, from ministers who were sympathetic to his movement. He faced harsh criticism. He faced criticism among the students that he encouraged to get involved with in the movement, SDS and SNCC and others in the 1960s. Now that also speaks to the messiness of these movements, and we need to appreciate that. As a historian, I can certainly present the history of let's say the battle against racial slavery in America in a sort of nice, coherent manner. But the reality is, and with all of these movements, it is very messy. A lot of disagreements, a lot of internal fighting going on, but nonetheless, there's this almost, in some cases, a kind of clunky push towards the goal, right? And the goal of greater justice. So I should emphasize the fact that I support nonviolence, and we must support nonviolence, but there's also a messiness to these movements as well. I also want to, this came to mind, I also want to say something about this, came to mind last night. We are in the midst of a lot of these protests over the years. The deaths of African-American men and women at the hands of law enforcement. We have become familiar, some of us have become a little bit annoyed with the metaphor of the bad apples. Well, there's, don't condemn the police force because of a few bad apples. Now, deep down, I will admit that there is something cogent to that. I can understand what's being said there. But if we keep seeing these bad apples, if we keep getting bad apples, perhaps we need to look at the orchard. maybe there's something wrong. If you don't mind me extending the metaphor a bit, maybe we need to look at the orchard. At the same time, the peaceful protests around the United States right now, in many ways, are condemned because of those that take advantage of the system, like looters. Well, why couldn't we apply the same argument in that case? That is, among these protesters, look, there are just some bad apples. So don't condemn all the protesters because of a few bad apples. Maybe we want to be consistent with that argument, because there are plenty of protesters who are protecting businesses, big and small, from potential looters. There are protesters who are protecting the lives of law enforcement. So we need some wisdom, and we need some discernment in avoiding making a lot of these generalizations. Let's not lose sight of the goal. Let's harness the collective outrage and frustration and use it in such a way that it's motivated by a love for God and a love for neighbor. Okay, so in the next micro lecture, I want to discuss the history and the anatomy of race and racism. And I'm going to divide this lecture into two parts. The first part will, first of all, try to give us a working definition of race, and then explore the intellectual justifications for race and racism in America. The second part of this overall mini lecture on race will deal with the material conditions that have created and also perpetuated race and racism in the United States. So with that, let me first offer a definition of what is race. What does race mean? There are some things that we have to separate from our discussion. Let us distinguish race from ethnicity. I think that is very important. Let's also distinguish race, or separate or divide race from biology. Let's also qualify race by highlighting the fact that difference is not necessarily a negative thing. We see difference all over the place. Differences in language, differences in fashion, differences in tastes in music, in food, etc. So it's not, strictly speaking, differences. Race, I will say, and perhaps boldly say, race is a culture. Race is the existence, the created reality or the created existence of a relegated or a despised other. A relegated or despised other, someone who is secondary to the norm or extremely despised, but someone who is nonetheless outside of the outside or below the culturally dominated group, let's call it. Okay? It's a relegated or despised other. And we also need to consideration, it's not strictly an individual, it is a group. It's the group that defines the individual, not the individual that defines the group. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding of us to take one individual and separate him from that group. for the purposes of dismantling race or racism, because you have to look at how the group is created. So again, race is the dynamic creation of a relegated or despised other. It is difference, but difference connected to relations of power. Relations of power. So let me repeat, difference is okay. You know, I think a lot of people misunderstand this. I'm different from you, you're different from me. That's not the problem. The problem comes when I say that my difference makes me better than you. Whether I explicitly say that or I assume a context that says my condition is better than yours, and I have therefore a right to, let's say, dominate you or have superiority over you. So it is difference related to power. Now, there's also a couple. There's sort of two different types of racism. There is overt racism, or what we might call hostile racism. That is racism that says, you know, I despise this group, I hate this group, right? And that's the kind of racism that we assume we can identify pretty clearly. But even, I mean, you can find plenty of people who will express what is clearly hate for another and yet still say that they're not racist. The other kind of racism is latent racism. It's often called benevolent racism. I don't like that term, benevolent racism, because it's still racism and there's nothing benevolent about it. Benevolent racism or latent racism or reverse racism is the examples of latent racism would be something like, you know, African Americans are not good swimmers because they are too buoyant. Or African Americans have great rhythm. Asians are just good at math. The Irish, they're just so funny. They have such humor to them. These are all, this is racist, and it needs to stop. Now, what connects both hostile and benevolent racism is a view of the essential nature of the other. That is to say, it is to view a class or a group of people and distinguish them based on their ontology, based on their nature, or based on their essence. So I borrow from philosophy that the term ontology relates to essence or being. So it's to say that the other, or to describe the other in such a way that makes you believe that they're of a different ontology or of a different being. Some scholars, social scientists or those in the humanities like myself, would use the term essentialist. It's an essentialist argument. So take latent racism, for instance. You know, Asians are just good at math. That's what we call an essentialist argument, and we need to be careful about that. From my perspective, all human beings are the image of God. They are made just a little lower than the angels. And so human beings have we all have a very special status under our creator, under the creator God. If we make further distinctions, if we make one human below another human being in a relation of dominating or hegemonic power, I think that is to attempt to become God ourselves, which is the root of sin. and it's not an act of loving a neighbor. Okay, so let's get back to this issue of race as culture, race as culture. So I kind of described, just kind of give you a working definition of what race is and the different shades of race and racism. And that's why I have a backslash at the beginning of race, racism, because I want to use them interchangeably. But now let's define what culture is. Culture is a language / text solidified by habits over time. Now let's explain what this means. Culture is a language, not just your spoken language. You know, language brings us together. Language is created to, you know, give ourselves an identity. It draws people together. When I am when I'm in downtown Shanghai, and I can pick out some of the Chinese language that's going on around me, but my language, my Chinese is not as good as my wife's or my kids. Right now, I'm old. But I can pick out some language, but for the most part, I feel a little bit lost. But every once in a while, I'll hear way in the distance someone speaking English. And immediately when I hear them speaking English, I'm drawn to them. We've immediately created a cultural bond. But language includes broadly text like the clothes that you wear, the music that you listen to, the neighborhoods you live in. That creates a cultural text, right? So it's a text, it's a language that creates your identity. It creates individual identity and also group identity. But this group identity, or individual or group identity that evolves, that is this language or this text that comes to sort of stick to us or create us, it's something that happens over time. That's why I say culture solidifies our habits. Our identity is solidified by our habits over time. Let me give you an example. Every Sunday morning, my kids and I put on certain items of clothes that we don't normally wear during the week, may not wear during the week. I carry a backpack. Sometimes we carry these books, happen to be Bibles. We carry these books. We get into a van and we leave our neighborhood and come back in the evening, back to our house. Now our neighbors are watching us. They're saying, what are they doing? Every Sunday morning, they do these certain things. They have these certain practices. And so our neighbor, excuse me, our neighbor will develop an idea, will try to get an understanding of who we are based on, based on our everyday habits. Now, the second point here says that culture is the unintended consequence of our social, intellectual, and economic systems or activities. Now, I say unintended consequences because when I put on my backpack and my Sunday best, and which is not really my Sunday best, and I carry my Bible, I go into a van, and my family comes with me, I'm not really thinking about the identity that I'm creating for myself. I'm not conscious of that, nor am I conscious of what my neighbors are thinking about me. Sometimes I am, but in this case, I'm not really thinking about my neighbors. Although being a foreigner in China does make you a little bit more aware of everything that you are doing. Not necessarily in a bad way or because there's some danger, just because you're just more conscious of it. So I'm not thinking about the identity that I'm creating for myself, nor are my neighbors aware that they too are creating an identity that they're imposing on me. By following my habits, they're generating an idea maybe a fuzzy and unclear idea of who I am and who my family might be, but they're not necessarily aware of what's going on. We're nonetheless doing it. We are nonetheless always involved in creating identity, either for ourselves or others are creating an identity for us. Where we associate, who we associate with, that's the social, or what we do for a living, that's the economic. What we may think, how we speak to one another, that shapes an identity, you know, of who we are. But our neighbors are also associating with us. They're also speaking about us. They're also working with us. And so there's this constant culture, is this dynamic networks of meaning that are always sort of interacting to create identities for myself, for my neighbor, and on and on. Now, race and racism has been supported by certain ideas in America. And I'll say at the outset that I'm very pleased, I'm very thankful. We all should be thankful that we don't hold to a lot of these ideas anymore. And one of the reasons why we don't hold to these ideas, we see these as unconvincing and erroneous and even immoral, is because we've been convinced of that by the aggressive activism and dissent and protest of those who have had to grapple with these ideals, those who have rejected these racist ideas. But what were some of these ideas? Well, let's break this down into religious ideas, some of the more popular racial or racist religious ideas, and then some scientific ideas. And again, I bring these up to say, well, where does race and racism come from? There's intellectual origins, there's religious origins, there are scientific origins as well. So let's look at religion first. Again, there's a lot of different arguments. I'll just highlight a couple. The first comes from the idea that slaves, or the relegated other, sorry, don't say, let me edit that, not slaves, but the relegated other is tied to cursed forms of labor. In Joshua 9, we have the story of Joshua cursing or condemning the Gibeonites in their role to in relation to the Israelites. They became hewers of wood and drawers of water. In the Bible, hewers of wood and drawers of the water is the lowest form of labor that you can be involved in, and it's usually reserved for cursed people. So this tells us one thing, very important, that the relegated other is always connected to some form of labor activity. And we'll get to that in the second part of this mini lecture. Another Bible argument comes from Genesis 9. Here we have the story of Noah, who plants a vineyard and produces some wine from this vineyard, and he gets drunk. His son Ham sees him naked and drunk. Who knows really what happened? Maybe something happened where he dishonored his father. And he goes and tells his brothers, and then his brothers come and cover up his nakedness, Noah's nakedness. When Noah comes to, he curses Ham's descendants. Ham's descended Canaan, saying that he will be a servant to his brothers for dishonoring his father. And according to tradition, or according to some theories, that the descendants of Ham and the descendants of Canaan traveled into Africa. And they were a cursed group that constantly traveled around. Now, even those that in 19th century America and antebellum America that were racist themselves and supported racist arguments from the Bible, many of these intellectuals even found that argument a little bit weak, though it was pushed by many, and a lot of people adopted the argument. You can even look at another argument in Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, right? Abel presented a sacrifice to God, which was accepted by God. Cain offered a sacrifice, but it was not accepted by God. Cain was very angry over this, and he killed his brother Abel. God then cursed Cain. Basically, the consequence of that curse was that wherever he worked the land would spoil. And so Cain came to God and says, God, this is too heavy for me. This is too difficult for me. I can't handle it. Everywhere I go, people will know that I cursed the ground and they're going to kill me for it. So God said, fine. And he put a mark on Cain. Now, some theories included that mark was the black skin, the dark skin, to set him apart, so that people wouldn't kill him, right? If anyone killed Cain, those people would be judged by God as well. So again, there's another theory that the descendants of Cain had dark skin and that they too traveled into Africa. Again, not a very strong argument, and a lot of anti-slavery advocates, abolitionists decimated these arguments. If you want to know more about the biblical arguments related to slavery, you can purchase my book, To Preach Deliverance to the Captives. Shameless plug. To think more about that. Well, there's these Bible arguments, there's these religious arguments from Christianity, but there are more popular arguments in the realm of what we would consider science, immature science. Professional science develops a little bit later in the late 19th, early 20th century, but there are scientific theories, what we might call scientific racism. The more popular scientific theory, and in fact this was a lot stronger than some of the theological arguments, was the argument from climate and region. Different races evolved in different regions of the world, and the sort of development of human intellect and strength and culture development, etc. Any sort of racial development was seen on an evolutionary scale, and this is before Darwin, in fact, but human development was based on climate and region. So to make the argument, I'm going to run the danger of making the argument a little bit simplistic here, but the basic argument is that a more advanced race was one that came from a harsh environment. So those that came from colder climates, cold, gloomy, oppressive environments, developed greater intellectual, developed a greater intellect, developed greater strength, developed greater creativity, because people in these groups had to learn how to survive, right? And so let's say people in the region of, let's say England, right? England is cold, it's gloomy, it's boring. I'm just kidding, it's not, it's wonderful. But certain people in certain environments had to use their brain to learn how to survive. People that evolved in warmer climates like South America or places like Africa didn't need to use their brains, their intellect, their creativity to figure out ways to survive. They can live off the land, right? And so as a result, their intellectual capacity was not as evolved as other groups in other geographic areas. So these became very powerful arguments, even used by Christians who believe that all come from one blood, or different geographical or geological arguments that said that humans were created in different places. Okay. Later in the 19th century, we have the developments of phrenology, that is the study of the measurements of the skull to determine the evolution of certain people, certain groups. And then of course we have the coming of Darwinism. Darwin provided a theory of the origins of life without a creator, without the need of believing in a creator. And for Darwin, biology was all about the struggle for the superior species or the superior race. So in the biological world, organisms that survived because they were able to struggle with and then cast off the sort of weaker biological element for the advancement of nature. Now, others like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, who's a professor the latter was a professor in the United States, applied Darwin's theory to society. In the late 19th century in America, America was becoming increasingly diverse. There was a massive amount of immigrants coming to the United States from newer places, that is, immigrants that were coming from places that were that a lot of Americans at the time were unfamiliar with. Eastern Europe, a lot from Eastern Europe, a lot from China. And so the theories of Darwin's the theories of Darwin. The theory of Darwin was applied to different social groups. And so certain groups, certain racial groups were placed in this sort of evolutionary hierarchy. There were superior races, there were lower races. The Anglo-Saxon race was placed on, you can almost say, well, according to one a popular writer, Josiah Strong, in his book, Our Country, said that nature has chosen the Anglo-Saxon race as not only the superior race, but the leader of human progress. And Josiah Strong says that it was Charles Darwin who was keen enough, he was sharp enough to identify this fact. Now, social Darwinism, in the trappings of science, was very insidious. It could be a very dangerous theory because it was used in such a way that it could assuage the conscience from exterminating lesser races. Social Darwinism justified some of the murder, some would say genocide, and certainly a cultural holocaust against Native Americans after the American Civil War with the numerous Indian wars. Excuse me. Social Darwinism justified some of the programs to exterminate the Jews in Europe around the time of World War II. Social Darwinism was used to justify immigration restriction in the United States for a long history. It was used to sterilize women who were the potential offspring of feeble-minded cognitively handicapped people in America. And this, and the history of sterilizing women who would potentially give birth to lesser races was actually protected by the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, a Supreme Court that has yet to be recognized and yet to be overturned. Social Darwinism was used also to sterilize women who were non-white, African-American women, to reduce the population of American women, to identify Jewish women, to sterilize Jewish women in order to reduce the Jewish population, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well. Social Darwinism was also used to motivate some of the syphilis experiments in the Deep South. The violence done in the name of science against African Americans that continued well into the 1970s. There are still those who are alive, African Americans, and even some among white working class individuals who are still alive from the syphilis experiments back in the 1960s. Social Darwinism motivated all of these. Now, I think I'll make a generalization that a lot of us have rejected these ideas. Certainly the intellectual community has rejected a lot of these ideas, at least in relation to Darwinism, though there are still discussions about genetic mutation and even manipulating DNA and manipulating even fetuses, children in the womb to get superior children. But nonetheless, I think we've challenged a lot of these ideas, and again, we've challenged them and we've rejected a lot of these ideas because of the activism of protesters throughout history. In the second part to this mini lecture, I want to talk about the material conditions of race and racism in America. So once again, I hope this is edifying. If you do have any questions, please contact me.